The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Lincoln Park, its golden rays streaming through the canopy of oaks and maples. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and the occasional laughter of children echoed from the playground. On a weathered bench near the park's center, Elijah Bennett sat quietly, his cane leaning against his knee. The polished wood beneath his hands was cool, grounding him in the moment. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could let the world drift away. At 68, Elijah's life was no longer defined by the uniforms he once wore or the battles he had fought. His years in the military had shaped him into a man of quiet dignity. His back straight even now, though his joints protested with every movement. A faded hat embroidered with the words, "Vietnam Veteran," sat snugly on his head, its presence as much a statement as a shield. The tranquility was disrupted by the sound of raised voices. Elijah turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing as a group of 3 young men swaggered down the path. Their laughter was loud and mocking, the kind that carried an undercurrent of menace. The tallest of them, a wiry man with a crooked grin and a restless energy, nudged his companions. They were coming closer. Elijah sighed inwardly. He'd seen their kind before, boys who mistook cruelty for strength. He focused on the rustling leaves above him, willing the encounter to pass. But the leader of the group, Derek Marshall, wasn't one to let things slide. "Hey, old man," Derek called out, his voice sharp and grating. Elijah didn't respond, keeping his gaze fixed on the treetops. Silence, he had learned, was often the best weapon against provocation. Derek's grin widened as he took this as an invitation to push further. "Yo, I'm talking to you," he shouted, stepping closer. His companions, Evan and Caleb, followed, their postures exuding mockery and bravado. Still, Elijah remained quiet, adjusting the brim of his hat and leaning back slightly. His heart beat steadily, but he felt the familiar stirrings of tension in his chest. Derek stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over Elijah. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Too deaf to hear me?" He gestured to his friends. "Maybe he's just too stuck up to say hello." Evan snickered. "Maybe he thinks this park belongs to him." Elijah turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting Derek's. His voice, calm but firm, cut through their jeers. "Afternoon, gentlemen." For a moment, the 3 were caught off guard. Derek recovered quickly, his grin twisting into something more sinister. "Gentlemen, huh? That's rich. But we're not here for niceties. Old man, we're here to remind you who runs this place." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "Is that so?" he said, his tone flat, devoid of fear. Derek took another step closer, his face inches from Elijah's. "Yeah, that's so. You think you can just sit here like you own the place? Like people like you belong here?" The words were laced with venom, their meaning unmistakable. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he remained seated, his hand resting lightly on his cane. "This park," he said evenly, "is open to everyone, but I suspect that's not the real issue here. Is it?" Caleb barked a laugh. "Look at him, acting all wise. You've got no idea what's coming." "Old man." Derek leaned in, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "Maybe it's time we taught you a lesson." Elijah's grip on his cane tightened ever so slightly. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. "You boys should walk away. Now." The threat was subtle but undeniable. Derek straightened, his grin faltering for a fraction of a second before he forced it back. "Or what?" he sneered, motioning for his friends to spread out. "You gonna fight us, Grandpa?" The tension thickened as they closed in. Elijah remained seated, his body still but coiled with the instinct of a man who had faced far greater threats. He was ready for whatever came next, though he didn't relish the prospect. Just then, a voice rang out, firm and commanding. "Hey, step away from him." The group froze, their heads snapping toward the source. Noah Bennett, tall and broad-shouldered, stood a few yards away. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, but his posture radiated authority. His sharp eyes locked onto Derek, and his jaw was set in a way that brooked no argument. Derek recovered quickly, his bravado returning. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Noah stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Derek. "I'm the man who's going to make you regret this." Evan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Caleb, but Derek held his ground. "Oh yeah?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What, you're gonna call the cops?" Noah smirked faintly. "I won't need to." There was something in his tone, a quiet confidence that unnerved Derek. But pride and the need to assert dominance won out. He stepped forward, raising his chin. Big words. Let's see if you can back them up. Before anyone could react, Noah moved. His fist connected with Derek's jaw in a single, precise motion, sending the man stumbling backward. Evan and Caleb hesitated, unsure of whether to advance or retreat. Derek, clutching his face, glared at Noah. "You're gonna pay for that." Noah's voice was low, calm, and deadly. "No, you're going to walk away. Right now, before this gets worse." Evan took a step back, pulling on Caleb's arm. "Let's go. Man, this guy's serious." Derek hesitated, his eyes flicking between Noah and Elijah. Finally, with a growl of frustration, he spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning and storming away. Evan and Caleb followed quickly, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. As the group disappeared down the path, Noah turned to his father. "You okay, Dad?" Elijah nodded slowly, leaning back against the bench. "I'm fine." They were more bark than bite. Noah frowned, his hands on his hips. "That doesn't mean they're harmless. Guys like that always come back. And they come back worse." Elijah sighed, his expression somber. "I know." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling over them. Finally, Noah spoke, his voice firm. "We'll handle it, Dad. Together." Elijah nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Together. The drive back to Elijah Bennett's modest house was quiet, the hum of the car engine the only sound. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. The streets of the small, tightly knit neighborhood were lined with oak trees, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze. Despite the tranquility of the scene, a storm brewed in Elijah's mind. Noah glanced at his father, his jaw tight. "They're not done," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Guys like that don't just let things go." Elijah turned to him, his expression calm but thoughtful. "I know their type, Noah. They're cowards at heart. They lash out when they think they can win." "That's exactly what worries me," Noah replied, gripping the wheel tighter. "They'll regroup, find more of their kind, and come back. I can feel it." Elijah leaned back, his hand resting on the worn fabric of his cane. "Let them try. I've been through worse." Noah shook his head, his voice tinged with frustration. "This isn't just about you, Dad. It's about what they represent. Hate like that doesn't stay quiet. It grows, festers, and spreads." Elijah didn't reply immediately. His eyes drifted to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. After a moment, he said, "You're right, son, but you can't let it consume you." The car turned onto the quiet street where Elijah's house stood, a modest brick structure with a small, neatly kept yard. Noah parked and killed the engine, sitting for a moment in silence before speaking again. "You've dealt with this your whole life, haven't you?" he asked, his tone softer now. Elijah exhaled deeply, his gaze distant, "Longer than I care to remember." Inside the house, the familiar scent of old books and cedar greeted them. Elijah's home was a sanctuary of memories, shelves lined with military memorabilia, framed photographs of family, and faded newspaper clippings chronicling his time in the service. The house was small, but it was warm and full of life. Elijah eased into his favorite chair by the window, his cane resting beside him. Noah moved to the kitchen, putting on a pot of coffee. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. "Dad," Noah began after a moment, "why didn't you call me sooner? If I hadn't been there today." Elijah held up a hand to stop him. "Because I've spent my life standing up to men like that. Noah, I didn't need you to fight my battles then. And I don't need you to now." Noah stepped into the living room, leaning against the doorway. "This isn't just about pride, Dad. It's about staying safe." Elijah's gaze softened. "It's not pride, son. It's knowing when to stand firm and when to let go. But I'll admit, having you there today made a difference." Noah nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He walked over to the shelf, picking up a framed photo of Elijah in his army uniform. He was young then, standing with a group of fellow soldiers, their faces weary but resolute. "You were a fighter back then," Noah said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I still am," Elijah replied, his voice steady, "just a little slower on my feet." The two shared a quiet laugh before falling into a comfortable silence. Finally, Elijah gestured toward a wooden chest sitting in the corner of the room. "Open that," he said. Noah walked over, lifting the lid to reveal a collection of old notebooks, each one meticulously labeled. He picked up the top notebook, flipping through the yellowed pages filled with Elijah's neat handwriting. "What's this?" Noah asked, intrigued. "Journals," Elijah replied. "Notes from my time in the service. I've kept track of everything over the years, names, events, patterns I noticed. You'd be surprised how much of what I learned back then still applies today." Noah sat down across from his father, thumbing through the pages. "You've been keeping records this whole time?" Elijah nodded. "When you've lived as long as I have, you see things repeat. History has a way of coming back around." Noah's eyes narrowed as he scanned one of the pages. "This isn't just military notes, Dad. These are observations about people, groups, behaviors." Elijah leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. "When I came back from the war, I realized the fight wasn't over. The battlefield just changed. It wasn't rifles and grenades anymore, it was prejudice, systems, and attitudes. I started noticing the patterns, the way hate organizes itself." Noah closed the notebook, his expression serious. "This could help, Dad. What you've written here, it's a blueprint for understanding people like them. That's why I kept it," Elijah said simply. "Not just for me, but for you, for anyone willing to keep fighting." Later that evening, as the stars began to dot the night sky, Noah sat on the porch, staring out into the darkness. Elijah joined him, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "They'll come back," Noah said after a long pause. "Yes," Elijah agreed, his voice calm. "And when they do?" Elijah's gaze was steady, his voice firm. "We'll be ready." The following morning brought a heavy gray sky that mirrored the tension lingering in the Bennett household. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and gazing out the window. The faint sound of birds chirping was the only thing breaking the stillness. Across from him, Noah scrolled through his phone, his sharp eyes scanning the screen for news. "They haven't stopped," Noah said, breaking the silence. "There's already chatter online about what happened yesterday." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of chatter?" Noah turned the phone toward him, showing a message thread on a private forum. The posts were laced with anger and hate, thinly veiled threats directed at Elijah. One post, in particular, caught Elijah's eye. "The old man and his hero son think they can stand against us. They don't know who they're messing with. This isn't over." Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Cowards. They hide behind their screens, trying to stir the pot." "Cowards or not," Noah replied, setting the phone down, "we can't ignore this. They're angry, and they're organized." Elijah leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. "They'll make their next move soon. They're too angry to let it go, and too stupid to stay subtle," Noah added, standing and pacing the small kitchen. "These types always trip over their arrogance." Elijah chuckled softly. "That's where you get it from." Noah shot him a look, but there was a hint of a smile. "If they're planning something, we need to get ahead of it. Do you still have those contacts from the VFW?" Elijah nodded. "A few. Most of them are retired, like me, but they still hear things. I can make some calls." "Good," Noah said. "I'll reach out to some of my own people. The more we know, the better we can prepare." By late afternoon, the Bennetts had started piecing together a rough picture of their adversaries. Elijah had spoken to several old friends, and while their information was patchy, it painted a concerning picture. "They've been seen hanging around that old gas station on Elm Street," Elijah said, pointing to a map spread across the coffee table. "It's abandoned, but people have reported activity there at odd hours." Noah nodded, marking the location with a red pen. "And I found out the leader of their little group is a man named Travis Hallman. He's been linked to several hate groups in the area, though nothing that's ever stuck legally." Elijah frowned. "Travis Hallman? That name sounds familiar." Noah flipped through his notes. "He's been around for years. Mostly stays under the radar. But he's got a reputation for organizing and rallying people like Derek. He's smart, Dad. This isn't some street thug. He knows how to manipulate." Elijah leaned forward, his expression grim. "Smart or not, he made the mistake of underestimating us." That evening, Noah suggested they drive by the gas station to scout the area. "We won't engage," he said firmly. "I just want to see what we're dealing with." Elijah hesitated but eventually agreed. Fine, but if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. They drove Noah's unassuming sedan, the low hum of the engine blending into the quiet of the back roads. The gas station came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Its skeletal frame barely standing. The windows were boarded up, and the sign hung crookedly, rust eating away at the edges. Noah parked a short distance away, cutting the engine. "Stay low," he said, handing Elijah a pair of binoculars. Elijah adjusted the lenses, scanning the area. At first, it seemed deserted, but then a flicker of movement caught his eye. "There," he said, pointing, behind the building. Noah squinted through the dim light. 3 figures were unloading something from the back of a truck. "Crates, by the look of it." "Supplies," Noah muttered. "They're stocking up for something. Or someone," Elijah added, his tone heavy with implication. The two watched in silence as the figures worked quickly, unloading and carrying the crates inside. Finally, the truck pulled away, disappearing down the road. The gas station returned to its eerie stillness. "Let's get out of here," Noah said. "We've seen enough." Back at the house, the Bennetts reviewed what they'd seen. Noah was already on his laptop, cross-referencing the truck's plates with known associates of Travis Hallman. Elijah leaned over his shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the screen. "This isn't small time," Noah said. "They're gearing up for something bigger." Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll stop them before they can act." Noah paused, looking up at his father. "You're ready for this, aren't you?" Elijah met his gaze, his voice steady. The next morning, Elijah woke early, the first rays of sunlight barely breaking through the curtains. He sat in his chair by the window, the warmth of a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hands. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on his mind, but there was a clarity in his thoughts now, a purpose that had been missing in the quiet years since his retirement. Across the house, Noah was already awake, hunched over his laptop at the dining table. His focus was unrelenting as he pored over files, maps, and lists of names. The remnants of a hastily eaten breakfast, half a bagel and an empty coffee mug, were pushed aside to make room for his notes. "You've been at it all night?" Elijah asked as he approached, his cane tapping softly against the floor. "Couldn't sleep," Noah admitted, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. "I've been tracing Travis Hallman's connections. He's more entrenched than we thought." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "How bad?" Noah gestured to the screen. "He's tied to at least 3 different hate groups, all operating under the radar. Recruitment, weapon smuggling, even financing smaller cells across the state. The guy's been busy." Elijah nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "And we're just scratching the surface." "I bet. That's the problem," Noah said, his frustration evident. "We can't do this alone. We need more eyes, more hands." Elijah gave a thoughtful hum, then walked to the small wooden chest in the corner. Opening it, he rifled through its contents until he pulled out an old address book. He flipped through the yellowing pages, stopping at a name scrawled in bold, blocky handwriting. "Raymond Ray Turner," Elijah said aloud, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We served together back in the day. He's retired now, but he's still got an ear to the ground." Noah glanced at him, intrigued. "Think he'll help?" "If I know Ray, he's been waiting for a fight like this." By mid-morning, Elijah and Noah were pulling up to a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town. The property was surrounded by tall oaks, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. A well-kept truck sat in the driveway, and the faint sound of a radio playing old blues music filtered through the open garage door. Elijah stepped out of the car, taking a moment to steady himself with his cane. He walked to the garage, where a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard was bent over an old motorcycle. "Ray," Elijah called. The man straightened, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. When he saw Elijah, his face broke into a wide grin. "Well, I'll be damned. Eli Bennett, what brings you to my neck of the woods?" Elijah clasped his hand firmly. "A problem I think you'll want to hear about." Ray's expression sobered instantly. "Come on inside, let's talk." The 3 men sat around Ray's kitchen table, a pot of coffee steaming between them. Elijah recounted the events of the past few days, his tone calm but measured. Ray listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with every detail. "So, this Travis Hallman," Ray said finally, leaning back in his chair. He's the one running the show? Noah nodded. From what we've pieced together. Yeah, he's dangerous. Ray, smart, connected, and bold enough to act. Ray let out a low whistle. Sounds like a real piece of work. What's the plan? We're working on that, Elijah said. But we need allies. People we can trust. Ray's gaze shifted between father and son, and a slow smile spread across his face. You always did have a way of dragging me into trouble. Eli, you in? Elijah asked. Ray slapped the table with a laugh. Hell, I'm in. You don't even have to ask. That evening, Ray introduced them to two more retired servicemen, Carlos Vega and Tommy Greer. Both men with extensive experience and a deep-seated sense of justice. Together, they pored over the map Noah had brought, marking potential locations tied to Travis's network. This old gas station, Carlos said, pointing with a calloused finger. If they're using it to store supplies, it's a prime target, but we'll need to be careful. They won't leave it unguarded. We've already scouted it, Noah said. It's active, but they're keeping a low profile. My guess is they're waiting for a shipment or a meeting. Then we strike before they can regroup. Tommy added, hit them hard, hit them fast. Elijah raised a hand. We're not vigilantes. We gather evidence, we document, and we call in the authorities when the time comes. Agreed, Noah said, but if it comes to a fight, we need to be ready. The group nodded, their determination palpable. The weight of the task ahead was heavy. But none of them flinched. Late that night, after the others had left, Elijah and Noah sat on the porch of Ray's house. The quiet hum of cicadas filling the air. You pulled a hell of a team together. Dad, Noah said. Elijah smiled faintly. It's not my first time. Noah chuckled, then grew serious. We're up against something big, aren't we? Elijah looked out into the darkness. His voice steady. Bigger than we thought, but we've got something they don't. What's that? Elijah turned to his son. His gaze firm, heart, and a reason to fight. The following evening, the Bennetts, Ray, Carlos, and Tommy gathered in Elijah's garage, which had been hastily converted into a makeshift command center. A large whiteboard stood against the wall, filled with photos, notes, and maps. Strings of red yarn connected the locations they had marked, forming a web that all pointed back to Travis Hallman. The air was tense but focused as Noah stood at the center. Addressing the group, here's what we know, Noah began, pointing to the map. The gas station on Elm Street is an active site. We've confirmed movement in and out of the location. And based on the crates we saw, they're stockpiling supplies, likely weapons or materials for propaganda. He moved his hand to another marked location. This bar here, the Broken Spoke, is where Hallman recruits. He's been seen meeting with associates there. But it's also a hub for other hate groups. It's too public to raid outright. But it's a key connection. Ray leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed. And you think he's coordinating something bigger from these places? Noah nodded. That's the pattern. He uses small cells to keep his operations decentralized. But we're seeing enough overlap to suggest there's a major event in the works. Carlos frowned, his thick mustache twitching as he leaned over the table. We don't have much time. Then, if he's planning something, he'll strike before we can fully organize. Elijah stepped forward, his cane tapping against the concrete floor. Then we need to make the first move. Disrupt his operations before he can act. As they strategized, the group decided to focus on the gas station first. It was remote enough to avoid unwanted attention and critical enough to Hallman's network that its loss would send a clear message. Their plan was simple. Gather evidence of illegal activity, call in the authorities, and ensure the site was shut down for good. I'll handle the surveillance. Tommy volunteered. I've got a camera rig we can set up on the tree line. We'll get footage of who's coming and going. I'll back you up, Ray added. If anything goes sideways, you'll need an extra set of eyes. Noah turned to Carlos. Can you pull any records on the property? Ownership, past activity, anything that gives us leverage? Carlos nodded. Consider it done. Elijah looked at his son. And us? Noah's expression hardened. We prepare for what comes next. Hallman won't take this lying down. The night of the operation was cold and still. The kind of quiet that carried every sound through the air. Tommy and Ray sat in a heavily camouflaged van parked a quarter-mile from the gas station. From their vantage point, they had a clear view of the site through a set of binoculars and a live feed from the hidden cameras they had placed earlier. Got movement, Tommy whispered. Adjusting the camera's angle, on the screen, two men emerged from the station, hauling a heavy crate toward the back of a truck. Ray squinted. Looks like ammunition boxes. You seeing this, Noah? Back at Elijah's house, Noah sat at the table. A laptop open in front of him displaying the live feed. Elijah stood behind him, his arms crossed as he watched. Yeah, we see it, Noah said. Keep tracking. We need as much as we can get before we call it in. Tommy's voice came through the earpiece. Copy that. Stand by. For the next hour, the team documented every move. More figures appeared, unloading crates and exchanging hushed conversations. One of them caught Ray's attention, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence. That's Hallman, Ray muttered. No doubt about it. Elijah's grip on his cane tightened. Then we're on the right track. Just as they were preparing to pull back, another vehicle approached the gas station, a sleek black SUV that stood out against the rusted trucks and vans. New player? Tommy speculated, adjusting the zoom on the camera. The SUV door opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out. He exchanged a firm handshake with Hallman before handing him a thick envelope. That's not just a lackey, Noah said, his eyes narrowing. That's someone funding this. Elijah frowned. And someone we need to identify. Get a clear shot of his face, Noah instructed. We'll run it against the database. Tommy nodded, angling the camera. Got it. Sending now. As the SUV pulled away, Hallman barked orders at the others, his body language tense. The group quickly loaded the crates into the trucks, moving with urgency. They're clearing out, Ray said. They know something's up. Noah cursed under his breath. We need to call it in now before they're gone. Elijah placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Not yet. Let them think they're safe. If we act now, we risk tipping Hallman off. Reluctantly, Noah nodded. Fine, but the second they leave, we move. Back at the house, the group regrouped to review the footage. The mystery man in the SUV was their biggest lead yet, a potential link to a larger network funding Hallman's operation. Carlos leaned over the laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I'll run this through every contact I've got. If this guy's connected, we'll find out who he is. In the meantime, Elijah and Noah discussed their next steps. Hallman's spooked, Noah said. He'll double down on security. But he'll also make mistakes. If we push hard enough, he'll crack. Elijah nodded, his expression grim. And when he does, we'll be ready. The pieces were falling into place. But the stakes were higher than ever. As the night deepened, each member of the team prepared in their own way, knowing the battle ahead would test not only their skills but their resolve. The team's makeshift command center was alive with activity the following morning. Maps, laptops, and printed photos covered the dining table, each item a piece of the intricate puzzle they were working to solve. Carlos sat at his laptop, deep in thought, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Next to him, Tommy flipped through printouts of vehicle registrations, cross-referencing the plates from the SUV that had visited the gas station the previous night. Elijah, Carlos called, his tone sharp. You need to see this. Elijah moved from his place near the window, where he had been watching the street with the careful eye of a seasoned soldier. What have you got? Carlos turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was a grainy photo of the man who had exited the SUV. His name, Wesley Grayson, was printed beneath it. This guy's no street-level thug, Carlos explained. He's an investment manager at a firm linked to multiple shell companies. A lot of those companies have been flagged for suspicious activity, laundering, untraceable donations to fringe groups, that sort of thing. Noah, who had been reviewing last night's footage on another laptop, looked up sharply. He's the money. Then, Hallman might be the face. But this guy's pulling strings from behind the scenes. Elijah frowned, leaning closer. Can we connect him to Hallman directly? Carlos nodded. Not yet, but I'm working on it. If we can follow the money, we'll have them both dead to rights. By mid-afternoon, Ray and Tommy returned from their surveillance post. They had tailed the trucks that left the gas station the night before and had new intel to share. They made a drop at a warehouse on the south side. Ray reported, marking the location on the map. It's one of those abandoned industrial sites, big, remote, and quiet, perfect for laying low. Tommy chimed in. We saw more of their crew there. At least 6 guys, all armed. They're definitely gearing up for something. Noah examined the new information, his mind racing. If that's where they're regrouping, we need to move fast. We can't let them consolidate. Elijah placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. We'll move, but not blindly. Holman's expecting us to react. We need to stay a step ahead. How? Tommy asked, leaning against the wall. Elijah's gaze was resolute. We take their eyes off us and put them on something else. Give them a reason to believe they're in control, even when they're not. That evening, the team devised a plan to draw Holman and his men out. Elijah suggested spreading misinformation through Holman's network, planting the idea that law enforcement was targeting the bar where he often recruited. Carlos would handle the digital aspect, using fake accounts to circulate the story. Meanwhile, Noah and Ray would conduct quiet surveillance at the warehouse, ensuring they could monitor any movements without being detected. If Holman thinks his bar is compromised, he'll shift focus, Elijah explained, and when he does, we hit the warehouse. The group worked late into the night, their determination evident in every meticulous detail they planned. Elijah couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride as he watched his son coordinate the team with precision. It reminded him of his own days leading missions in the field. The next day, Carlos launched the disinformation campaign. Posts began appearing in private forums and encrypted chat groups frequented by Holman's associates, warning of imminent raids at the Broken Spoke. The messages were carefully worded to sound like leaks from an inside source. Now we wait, Carlos said, leaning back in his chair. If this works, they'll shift their attention away from the warehouse. Hours passed, each one heavier with tension than the last. Finally, the team got their first break. Through a tapped communication line, they intercepted a call from Holman to one of his men. They're hitting the bar? Holman's voice was sharp, laced with frustration. Damn it, move everything to the warehouse. I want it secured before they come sniffing around. Noah clenched his fist, a grim smile on his face. Got him. By sunset, the team was in position near the warehouse. Ray and Tommy took the lead on reconnaissance, their eyes trained on the entrance. 2 guards stood by the door, rifles slung over their shoulders, while others milled about inside. They're on edge, Ray murmured into his earpiece. They know something's up. Good, Noah replied from his position in the car with Elijah. Keep eyes on them. We need to know if Holman shows. Minutes turned into an hour, the waiting almost unbearable. Then, just as the first stars appeared in the sky, a black SUV pulled into the lot. Holman stepped out, flanked by 2 men carrying large duffel bags. We've got him, Tommy whispered. Noah's voice was firm. Stay sharp. We don't move until we're sure we can take the whole operation down. Inside the car, Elijah adjusted his grip on his cane, his sharp eyes fixed on the warehouse. This is it, he said. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, its steel exterior glinting faintly under the pale glow of a distant street lamp. Inside, the hum of activity was barely audible, but it carried the weight of danger. Noah and Elijah sat in the sedan parked a safe distance away, their eyes trained on the live feed from the camera rig Ray and Tommy had set up earlier. They're consolidating, Noah murmured, watching as Travis Holman barked orders inside. His men moved methodically, unpacking crates of weapons and loading smaller boxes into duffel bags. They're gearing up for something big. Elijah leaned closer, his expression grim. We can't let those weapons leave this warehouse. If they do, we're looking at a disaster. Noah nodded, his jaw tightening. We won't. We've got the evidence we need, and backups on the way. But we can't let them scatter before the cops show. Elijah placed a hand on his son's arm. Then we hold the line, no matter what. Meanwhile, in the van positioned near the warehouse, Ray and Tommy kept a close watch on the guards outside. The 2 men at the entrance stood stiffly, their rifles held tight, occasionally scanning the area with flashlights. Looks like they're expecting trouble, Ray muttered. Good thing we're not trouble yet. Tommy smirked. Give it time. The quiet tension was broken when a sudden movement caught Ray's eye. A truck approached from the far end of the lot, its headlights off, rumbling to a stop near the warehouse. Got another vehicle coming in, Ray reported into his earpiece. Looks like more of Holman's crew. Stay sharp, Noah responded. If this escalates, we'll need to act fast. 2 men stepped out of the truck, one of them carrying a clipboard. They approached Holman, who was now standing near the entrance, engaged in a heated discussion. What do you think they're moving? Tommy asked, keeping his binoculars steady. "Whatever it is," Ray said grimly, "it's not leaving this place." As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew unbearable. The team's coordinated plan relied on timing. Wait for law enforcement to arrive and secure the area while ensuring no one escaped. But as the truck's engine revved again, Noah made a decision. "They're prepping to leave," he said, his voice sharp. "We can't let that happen." Elijah's gaze narrowed. "What's the play?" Noah adjusted his earpiece. "Tommy, Ray, block the exit. Use the van if you have to. We'll keep them contained until the cops show." Ray didn't hesitate. On it, the van's engine roared to life as Ray and Tommy moved into position, parking it across the narrow lot to cut off the only clear route out. The sudden movement drew the attention of Holman's men. "What the hell?" one of them shouted, raising his rifle. Holman turned sharply, his face twisting in anger. "We've got company. Lock it down." The guards by the door rushed toward the van, shouting and brandishing their weapons. From their vantage point, Noah and Elijah could see the chaos erupting. "This is it," Elijah said, gripping his cane tightly. "We make our stand here." The two men exited the sedan, moving swiftly but carefully toward the lot. Noah carried a sidearm holstered at his hip, while Elijah relied on the practiced weight of his cane. They stayed low, using the shadows for cover. As Holman barked orders, the men scrambled to secure the truck. A few began unloading the remaining crates while others aimed their rifles at the van. Ray's voice crackled over the earpiece. "They're getting antsy. We've got maybe 2 minutes before this blows wide open. Then let's give them something to think about," Noah said. He stepped out from behind cover, his voice booming across the lot. "Holman, it's over. Put your weapons down and step away from the truck." All eyes turned to Noah. Holman's sneer was audible even from a distance. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" "The guy who's about to ruin your operation," Noah replied coolly. "Your bar, your gas station, your little playhouse here, it's all under watch. Backup's already on the way." Holman's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "You're bluffing. Try me," Noah said, stepping forward. His posture was steady, unshakable. "Or better yet, stick around and ask the cops yourself." Holman hesitated, his gaze darting toward his men. "Take him out," he snapped. Two of the guards raised their rifles. But before they could act, a sharp, commanding voice rang out from behind them. "Drop your weapons." The unmistakable sight of Ray and Tommy stepping into the open, weapons trained on the guards, froze them in their tracks. "Think carefully," Ray added, his tone cold. "You're outnumbered, and the clock's ticking." The tension broke as the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The flashing red and blue lights were visible on the horizon, growing brighter with each passing second. Holman's face twisted in rage. "Damn it," he snarled, shoving one of his men toward the truck. "Get that stuff out of here now." Noah acted swiftly, charging forward before the men could react. He tackled one of the guards, disarming him with practiced precision. Elijah followed, moving with surprising speed as he swung his cane at the other guard, catching him in the knee and sending him to the ground. Ray and Tommy moved to secure the truck, their weapons trained on Holman and his remaining men. The gang hesitated, their bravado crumbling as the sirens drew closer. "You've lost, Holman," Noah said, his voice firm as he pinned the disarmed guard. "It's over." Holman glared at him, his chest heaving with frustration. "This isn't over," he spat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Elijah stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with. And now, so will the rest of the world." As law enforcement vehicles swarmed the lot, officers poured out, weapons drawn. Holman and his crew were quickly subdued, their hands zip-tied behind their backs as the officers secured the scene. Noah stood back, watching as the operation was dismantled. He turned to Elijah, who leaned on his cane, his face etched with both exhaustion and pride. "We did it," Noah said quietly. Elijah nodded, his voice steady. "One fight at a time, son." The flashing red and blue lights painted the warehouse in harsh streaks of color as officers moved methodically, cataloging the contents of the crates. Weapons, ammunition, propaganda, and financial documents were spread across tables, their stark reality a testament to the scale of Travis Holman's operation. Noah and Elijah stood off to the side, watching as Holman and his men were loaded into police vehicles. Holman's glare burned with fury. But there was a crack in his defiance, a hint of the desperation that had crept in as his empire crumbled. "You've made a mistake." Hallman spat at the nearest officer. "You think this ends with me? You think you've won?" The officer ignored him, slamming the car door shut. Noah turned to Elijah, his jaw tight. "He's not wrong. Hallman's just one piece of this puzzle." Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable. "But he's a big piece. And with him gone, the rest of it starts to fall apart." Back at Elijah's house later that night, the team regrouped in the living room. Carlos, Ray, and Tommy joined the Bennetts, their faces lined with exhaustion but tinged with satisfaction. Spread out on the coffee table before them were photos, receipts, and lists of names taken from the warehouse. "This is a treasure trove," Carlos said, flipping through a stack of papers. "These names alone could lead to half a dozen other cells. Maybe more." Ray nodded. "And these financial records? They tie Hallman directly to Wesley Grayson, the guy funding all this." Noah frowned, leaning forward. "Grayson's the key. We need to make sure he doesn't slip through the cracks." Tommy grunted in agreement. "Hallman's already hinted he's just the front man. If Grayson's pulling the strings, he's our next target." Elijah's voice cut through the conversation, calm but firm. "Then we don't stop here. We push forward." The room fell silent for a moment, each man processing the weight of the battle ahead. The next morning, Noah joined local law enforcement at the station for Hallman's interrogation. Seated across from the gang leader in a small, sterile room, Noah kept his posture steady, his gaze cold. Hallman leaned back in his chair, his cuffs jangling against the metal table. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "Arrest me, raid my warehouse, it doesn't matter. There's always someone else, someone stronger." Noah folded his arms. "You're right, there's always someone else. But you're finished." Hallman's grin faltered. "You don't know what you're up against. General, this isn't just me. This is an idea, a movement. And every movement needs funding." Noah countered. "Without it, you're just a bunch of angry men with nowhere to go. And we've already got Grayson in our sights." At the mention of Grayson, Hallman's expression darkened. "You think he cares about you? About anyone? He'll cut and run the second you close in. You'll never touch him." Noah leaned forward, his voice low. "We'll see about that." Outside the interrogation room, Carlos met Noah with new information. "I've been digging into Grayson's connections," he said. "One of the shell companies he's tied to owns a private airfield about 30 miles from here." Noah raised an eyebrow. "You think he's planning to disappear?" Carlos nodded. "If Hallman was right about him cutting and running, this is where he'll go. I'd bet on it." Elijah, who had joined them moments earlier, placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "Then we don't waste time. We stop him before he can get away." That evening, the team made their way to the private airfield under cover of darkness. The air was cool and heavy, the faint hum of distant engines breaking the stillness. Noah, Elijah, Ray, Carlos, and Tommy moved in silence, their every step calculated. From their vantage point on a nearby hill, they had a clear view of the airfield. A sleek jet sat on the tarmac, its engines idling. Grayson stood near the plane, flanked by 2 bodyguards and a small crew loading luggage and crates. "He's running," Noah whispered, his tone laced with satisfaction. "Just like we thought." Ray adjusted his binoculars. "Looks like he's got security. Armed, too." Elijah's gaze was steady. "Doesn't matter. We've come too far to let him slip away now." Noah nodded, his jaw tightening. "Carlos, call it in. Let the authorities know what we've got. The rest of us will keep him here until they arrive." The team moved swiftly but silently, circling the airfield to approach from multiple angles. As they closed in, Grayson seemed to sense something was wrong. He barked an order to his bodyguards, who raised their weapons and began scanning the area. Noah stepped into the open, his voice booming across the tarmac. "Grayson, it's over. Step away from the plane." Grayson turned, his expression twisting into one of anger and fear. "Who the hell are you?" "The man who's going to make sure you face justice," Noah replied. Grayson's bodyguards raised their weapons. But before they could act, Ray and Tommy appeared on either side, their own weapons trained on the group. "Drop them," Ray ordered, his voice ice cold. Now, the tension crackled in the air. But Grayson's men hesitated, realizing they were outmatched. Slowly, they lowered their guns. Grayson, however, didn't give up so easily. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed. "I have connections, power. You can't touch me. Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. You're right about one thing. Grayson, you've got power, but it's slipping through your fingers. And we're here to make sure it's gone for good. As sirens echoed in the distance, Grayson's shoulders slumped. His defiance crumbled as law enforcement vehicles pulled onto the airfield, their lights piercing the darkness. As Grayson was cuffed and led away, Noah and Elijah exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them. You did good, son, Elijah said, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Noah exhaled deeply, the weight of the mission finally easing. We both did. The team stood together as the operation concluded, their shared victory a testament to their resilience and determination. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now. They had dealt a decisive blow to the darkness they were determined to dismantle. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to the air, as if the world itself had been cleansed by the events of the night before. Noah, Elijah, and their team gathered in Elijah's living room, their expressions a mixture of relief and lingering determination. The news had already broken. Major headlines detailed the takedown of Travis Holman's hate network and the arrest of Wesley Grayson, the financier who had enabled it all. Photos of the weapons, propaganda, and financial records seized in the raids accompanied every story. Ray chuckled as he scrolled through the news on his phone. We're famous now, or at least infamous to the people who mattered. Carlos leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, and we've put a huge dent in their operations. These arrests are going to ripple through the entire network. Elijah, seated in his favorite chair by the window, nodded thoughtfully. It's a victory, but it's not the end. There's always someone waiting to take their place. Noah stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed. We've bought time, though, time for law enforcement, communities, and the people most affected to regroup and push back. Elijah smiled faintly, pride evident in his gaze. That's what matters, son, making it harder for hate to grow. As the team disbanded for the evening, each returning to their respective lives, Noah and Elijah remained in the quiet stillness of the house. The weight of what they had accomplished hung in the air, tempered by the knowledge of what still lay ahead. Elijah glanced at Noah, his voice breaking the silence. You did more than I ever could. You know, you took everything I taught you and turned it into something bigger. Noah sat across from him, shaking his head. I had the best teacher. Dad, you've been fighting this fight longer than I've been alive. Elijah chuckled softly. And you'll keep fighting it long after I'm gone. The words carried a solemn finality that neither man acknowledged aloud, but both understood deeply. Elijah's eyes drifted to the stack of notebooks on the coffee table, his life's work cataloging the patterns of hate he had spent decades combating. Take those, he said, nodding toward the notebooks. They're yours now. Noah hesitated. Dad, they're not just my story. Noah, Elijah interrupted gently. They're part of a bigger one. And you're going to write the next chapter. Noah reached for the notebooks, running his fingers over the worn covers. I'll take care of them. I promise. A week later, the Bennetts attended a community meeting held at the local civic center. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, united by the shared desire to stand against the kind of hatred and violence that Holman's network had propagated. Noah stood at the front, speaking to the crowd. His words were measured, his tone resolute. What we did wasn't just about stopping one man or one group. It was about sending a message that this community, this country, will not stand for hate. The crowd erupted in applause. But Noah raised his hand for quiet. But the fight doesn't stop here. It's in how we treat each other, how we educate, how we stand up when we see something wrong. It's in all of us. Elijah watched from his seat in the front row, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had fought many battles in his life. But this, seeing his son take the mantle, was perhaps his greatest victory. As the meeting concluded and people began to filter out, a young man approached Elijah. Mr. Bennett, he said nervously, I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. My family, we've dealt with people like Holman before. What you and your son did, it means a lot. Elijah smiled warmly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. Keep fighting the good fight, he said. It's not easy. But it's worth it. Later that evening, Noah and Elijah sat on the porch of Elijah's house, watching the stars. The air was cool and still, carrying with it the faint scent of the surrounding trees. The weight of the past few weeks seemed to lift. replaced by a quiet resolve. "You think it's enough?" Noah asked, breaking the silence. Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the sky, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "It's never enough, Noah, but it's a start, and sometimes, that's all we need to keep going." Noah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then we keep going." Elijah smiled, his heart full. Together, they sat in silence, father and son, knowing that while the battle was far from over, they had made their stand, and they would